Hello everyone, my name is Associate Professor Nick Conley and we're honoured to be partnering with Safeskies Australia today at this webinar to help promote aviation safety through safety education such as this webinar. Safeskies aims to identify and promote effective solutions to the safety challenges facing the aviation industry globally, and RMIT is really happy to support this initiative as Safeskies education partner. So welcome everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Wurrung and Burrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. And RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present, and the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. And it is my great honour to introduce our host today, Mr. Greg Hood. Greg will be running today's webinar. Greg is currently the Deputy Chair of Air Services, also the Chair of the Australian Hall of Fame, the Acting Chair of CSIRO's Marine National Facility, just to name a few. He has had an impressive career spanning over 40 years, and most recently was the Chief Commissioner of the ATSB. So we're very lucky to have him here with us, and I will hand over to Greg now to run today's proceedings. Thanks, Greg.
So good morning, my name's Greg Hood and I echo the acknowledgement of country provided by Associate Professor Nick Connolly. So today is the first of two webinars hosted by Safeskies Australia and RMIT, and I'd like to thank both organisations for their initiative in hosting this important event. So today we'll look at the critical role of pre-flight planning, every time you fly, of checklists, of NOTAMs, and demonstrating professionalism every time you get into the cockpit or you operate an uncrewed aerial system. To bring you a range of different perspectives, we have an outstanding panel this morning. Firstly, Lee Vesic, she's RMIT's Director of the RMIT Academy, commercial pilot, and she has a unique insight into the workings of government, having been the aviation advisor to the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack. We have Chris Mackay, Safeskies board member, pilot, and General Manager Safety Systems and Operations Support at Virgin Australia. Jill Bailey, Head of Flight Operations at Recreational Aviation Australia and pilot. Air Vice Marshal retired Alan Clements, Safeskies board member, CEO of L3 Harrison Australia, and a military and current warbird pilot. And finally, Jackie Jumovic, Safeskies board member and chief executive of Hover, a UAV. But first, some personal insights, and thanks to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the ATSB, for the following statistics. So the theme of today's webinar is sharing the airspace. So how well do you think that we've been doing this? So let's reflect on the last 50 years or so, let's say since the first man walked on the moon in 1969. So how many mid-air collisions do you think we've had in Australian airspace since man first walked on the moon? Any ideas? So since 1969, Australian airspace, there have been 114 mid-air collisions reported to the ATSB. Of these, 101 collisions involved VH registered aircraft. And if we drill down into the data even further, 94 mid-air collisions involved GA and 10 commercial air transport aircraft. To cut the data another way, the aircraft involved in the mid-air collisions were 125 aeroplanes, 59 gliders, 13 helicopters, 11 balloons, and 2 motorised gliders. And of these mid-air accidents, there were 37 that were fatal accidents. So the question I pose is, how well have we been sharing the skies up until now? Another of the statistics provided by the ATSB are the number of mid-air collisions and the near misses reported in the world of unmanned aerial systems. So in the last 5 years, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been 11 collisions between remotely piloted aerial systems and 362 what we call near encounters between crewed aircraft and RPAS. The vast majority of these occurred near major capital cities, and the vast majority were reported by regular public transport aircraft. So again, I pose the question, in the last 5 years, how safely have we been sharing the airspace, and are we prepared for the future? Are our training organisations training aviation entrants to be as safe and as professional as they can be? So here to kick off the discussion is Leah Vesic. So Leah, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Greg. I'll just do a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me? Anyone want to put a thumbs up?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. Now, I do have some slides to share to prompt some of my thoughts, so I'll just get that up. Can we see those slides? I'll take the silence as a yes. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you here today. As Greg mentioned, my role is Director at RMIT Aviation Academy. You may or may not be aware, RMIT University has a flight training unit. We've actually been providing flight training for just over 30 years this year. What we do essentially is deliver everything from ab initio all the way to commercial and air transport pilot license theory. We have multiple airline cadet programs that we run across 2 bases. So we're primarily based at Point Cook in Melbourne, and also a secondary base in Bendigo. So we have this fairly large operation, pushing up to 400 students this year. So as we're all seeing a really big boom in aviation in terms of the workforce shortage and the desire for the next generation to explore careers in aviation, we're set up to really support that system moving forward. But what's critical for us at the Aviation Academy is really the professionalism. So one thing from a training provider's perspective, day one at orientation, we really instill in the students that they are commercial pilots and they will be treated as commercial pilots from day one. When you look at an ab initio training organisation, the vast number of our students actually come from either high school or may have a degree already, or generally fairly junior in their career. So it's really up to us as education providers to set that foundation, to get it right from the start. So professionalism is a really big thing that we focus on. What do we mean by professionalism? Well, this is just one definition, and it's one that I stand by in terms of what we do at the Academy. It's really about the conduct, behaviour and attitudes of people that reflect the values of an organisation and the competencies of the individual. So what I mean by this is effectively professionalism requires 2 entities to play a part. It's not just about the pilot, but it's also about the organisation that they're involved in. And it's really incumbent on organisations such as RMIT to set that foundation right. So how do we do that? Well, there are some fundamentals of professionalism. The list is endless and really infinite. But in terms of some of the key areas from our perspective, what we highlight, it is these 3. So the first one is competence. So it's really important we instill in the future aviators that competence is key. To execute a task, you must have the skills and knowledge. We're not an industry that you can wing it. You really need to know what you're doing, because we are sharing the skies with so many, and we have a duty of care and a responsibility to others around us. So competence is really important. The second one, communication, so relevant to our discussion today. Communication must be clear, concise, and standardized. Again, from day one through our training, we tell our students, you must get your checklist right. We operate under SOPs, and there's 2 schools of thought, of course. Some schools prefer to go down the SOP route to emulate airlines, and some choose different. We go down the airline SOP path, and that's predominantly because the majority of our students end up in airlines. The second part to that, though, is also airlines are coming back with feedback to us, telling us that they really like that baseline standardization that comes through from ab initio training. So we're getting constant feedback from the industry that they prefer clear, concise communication through these checklists and SOPs. And thirdly, but certainly not last, is commitment, really instilling a commitment to safety and quality and continuous learning. It's really critical that these young people coming through to have a successful career in aviation must appreciate that they have a duty of care and a strict liability to maintain safety, quality, and their own continuous learning. So to wrap up, my thoughts in this space, running, a fairly large ab initio training environment, is it's never too early to teach professionalism. There's lots of skills as part of that we have a duty of care to set up, but equally it's on the individual too. Organisations can only set an individual up to succeed to a point, but then it's really important that that individual has those values that align with what the industry needs moving forward. The only other, I think, comments I'll make right now is really there's a new wave of aviation professionals coming through, and we're really in version 2.0. When you think about the first generation of aviators being 100 years, now we're going into the second century. We need to change the way that we teach and the way we expect young people to absorb information. It's really important that we look at technology, we look at mentoring programs, we look at industry pathways to set young people up for success. These are effectively fundamentals you need across your life, not just in aviation. So if we can set young people up for success for their careers going forward, whether it's in aviation otherwise, I think we're doing a good job. Thanks, Greg. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Leah. And once again, I think we're very fortunate to have you as the director of the RMIT Academy to be instilling those fundamentals of professionalism, the competence, the communication, and the commitment to those students. We'll switch now to Chris Mackay, and he has a unique perspective, having been the manager of safety for a number of airlines, and most recently his current appointment at Virgin Australia. So, Chris, over to you for your views. Chris seems to have frozen, and so hopefully, have I got you back now, Chris?
How's that? Is that?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. And thanks, everyone. Good morning. And firstly, a huge thanks to Leah, because hearing what Leah's doing in the RMIT is music to our ears, really, as an airline representative, to see that professionalism and rigour being built into the training right from the start. And that's a perfect segue into what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to focus on three kind of key themes and topics. And I was planning on sharing some statistics, but we all kind of know that there's some issues in airspace and airspace management in terms of our communication and interactions with airspace. We've talked a lot about Ballina in the past and the Pilbara region and how we're trying to manage those risks, but more about how we can mitigate those risks from a human factors perspective. There are really 3 points that summarise some of what I've seen in safety roles, as Greg has mentioned, particularly over the past few years, as we've come through the COVID period and back out again, and some of my interactions when I've been flying personally. And some really have contributed to accidents and serious incidents around the world, and some of which have been here in Australia. My first point is safety first. Of course, I'm going to say that, but this is not safety first as a slogan for a company, but this is safety first as a personal value. We all start off our safety aviation journey somewhere, and that needs to be embedded right from the start. Safety first is a mindset, regardless of the role. Whether we're flying aeroplanes, fixed wing, rotary wing, whether we're flying drones, whether we're on the ramp, or whether we're cabin crew engineers, we all have safety. We all must have safety first as the forefront of what we do, one of our core values. Safety first means a few important things. It means being prepared for whatever task we're about to embark on within the day. If you're flying, it's being prepared, it's planning for that flight, it's reading and understanding NOTAMs, it's understanding what the weather looks like, it's determining whether there's any threats and risks that you need to address, and thinking through how you may be able to mitigate those threats or risks as part of what you do. Safety first also means acting professionally. As Leah emphasised that point, professionalism is so important. A thorough walk around if you're a pilot, and a solid focus on what I call aviatorship. It also means following SOP, checklists, conducting tasks in a deliberate and measured way. And in a perfect world, SOPs, whether they're from a manufacturer or whether they're internal, would be built with risk management in mind. So if you follow risk SOPs, risk assessments have been conducted. In most cases, risks have been addressed. My second point is around a key focus on non-technical skills, or the soft skills that you need to conduct what you do every day. And we tend to focus a lot on technical ability across the industry right from the start. And that's driven partly by the requirements of the regulations to be specifically technically focused. But we need to focus also on the drivers for how we perform those technical skills well. It's important to understand it as an individual in the tasks that you undertake, what your human performance limitations are. How do you personally deal with fatigue? How do you deal with long days, lack of sleep, stress, workload, and a situation that's abnormal when some of those factors have accumulated? What impact does that have on you, and what impact does that have on the task you're about to undertake safely? Really important too is situational awareness, and this is something that is critically important when we are operating in airspace around Australia and around the world, is understanding what is in that airspace and how it may interact with you, either as a flying part of the flying element or even on the ground. It enables us to be team players in the broader aviation ecosystem, so having good situational awareness allows that to occur, and it helps us to help others where possible. So understanding where others are, if we're flying into an aerodrome, we can help them to help us to make sure that we all maintain safety within that environment. And while situational awareness, seems easy, it is something that develops over time, and it's not always a natural thing, but we often find that as other elements of our training become more natural, our situational awareness gets better. But a lack of situational awareness in any environment creates great risk to us personally and to others. So it really needs to be a focus.
All right, Chris, I don't know if you can hear me. We seem to have lost you there, but just to summarise, Chris has a unique perspective on aviation safety, heading up safety now for Virgin Australia. And I like the words that safety first is not just a slogan, it's a personal value. So I'd like to thank Chris for that contribution. Hopefully we can get him back for the questions. I'd like now to swing to Jill Bailey. So Jill Bailey has, again, another perspective on operations. Jill's the head of flight operations at Recreational Australia, and I'd like to welcome Jill for her view on perhaps the lighter end of town. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Greg. I really appreciate that, and appreciate the opportunity to present at this webinar. It's certainly important for us to think about these things from all aspects of aviation. There's the commercial end, and there's the end that flies for fun, which is where my focus is. From my background, I'm assuming there that I'm presenting and everything's good. From the perspective of what RAAus is as an organisation, we actually represent quite a significant portion of the total aviation pilot numbers and aircraft fleet, and that number is growing, obviously, as we increase our privileges. So we've been going for 40 years. That's only a drop in the bucket compared to a lot of other organisations, but in those 40 years we've seen some significant changes, particularly in the types of aircraft we operate, from the original rag and tube fun little ultralight aircraft, which is still part of our fleet and we're very much welcome, to the faster aircraft with quite sophisticated cockpits, which can probably rival some of what you see in the passenger carrying aircraft. I don't actually have a presentation as such. I'm just going to let you look at my lovely face and I'll just talk. From the perspective of RAAus, the CTAF operation at non-controlled aerodromes is probably the most common. We do have operations in controlled airspace, but the majority of our pilots will be operating in non-controlled environments. And that's where the highest risk exists, because there's any number of different types of operations sharing that airspace. So it can be anything from parachute operations to warbird, gliding operations, just private recreational flight training operations, etc. So one of the keys I think we've got a theme running through so far the presentations is professional behaviour and conduct isn't the realm just of commercial pilots. Professional behaviour and conduct can be demonstrated and should be strived for by all pilots, including recreational pilots. And it's also important to remember, I guess, that someone flying a recreational aircraft may also have a range of other qualifications. They may well be an ATPL in their working life and fly one of our aircraft because it's just fun, or they may have gliding quals or whatever the circumstances might be. So one thing that I believe RAOS is working towards quite effectively is talking about professional interactions and professional conduct at those airports, regardless of what type of operation. I guess I'm going to speak a little bit specifically about what we can do as pilots to improve the types of interactions and strategies we can employ. And one of the key ones at a non-towered or non-controlled aerodrome is radio calls. Obviously, it's the alerted, see and avoid principle that is the fundamental of what we do as pilots to self-separate when we're not in controlled airspace. And one of the key things that I'd like to have people consider is thinking about when they're making a radio call. Yes, it's important to have standard phraseology, but one of the other things is to think about what that other pilot might need to hear from you. Where are you going? What are you doing? Where are you right now? In clear, concise terms, and particularly relative to what that other pilot might be wanting to do themselves. So it's an extra mind space to go into, and it sort of builds on what Leah and Chris have been talking about, that we need to develop that situational awareness and think about those threat and error management strategies. So I like to think of it as a three-dimensional chess game. If there's any Star Trek fans out there, you have to think about not only where you are right now, but where you're going to be, where that other pilot is going to be of that other aircraft or other aircraft, multiple aircraft in the circuit, and how are there going to be any possible conflicts. Because if we can think further ahead, rather than waiting for that object to appear in our windscreen and doing a startled response, we can think about that is going to happen in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. What can I do now to reduce the risk of that occurring? So as I said, the key thing is effectively making sure you're making very clear calls that really clarify for the other pilot what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, when you're going to be doing it, and even why you're going to be doing it. It's also critical to understand the other procedures for other organisations. And let's talk generally about passenger transport. The safest approach for them is to just do a straight-in approach. They don't have the ability and the visibility out of the aircraft to be able to see if they're manoeuvring in a circuit. So straight-in approach is the safest way for them to actually enter a non-controlled airport. From our perspective as recreational pilots, we should be aware of that and give them the clear approaches, extending legs of circuits or interacting with that pilot to make sure that they're very clear about where you are and what you're doing. And I think Chris might have mentioned the Ballina proximity events that have happened. If comms had been probably established more clearly there, that would have been a factor and another slice of cheese to prevent that from occurring as it did. As an example, warbirds often have very different needs in terms of their visibility over the cowlings, particularly with tail draggers, and the fact that they get overheated very quickly, so they might need to get out and get off the runway very quickly. Glider pilots obviously have right of way, but it's critical for us to know where they are in order to be able to give them right of way. So radio calls and clear positions from them are important. And for a genuine ultralight aircraft, there are possibilities for them to do circuits below 500 feet, at 500 feet, rather than the 1,000 feet, and they'll be doing a much closer, tighter circuit. So the idea behind the spacing of the circuits is everyone will still take approximately the same amount of time to go around the circuit area, but we need to make sure that we're looking out on all directions for other aircraft in the circuit. And that leads to, as Leah said quite rightly, SOP, standard circuit procedures. CAS has given us a wonderful amount of educational material, visual flight rules guides, plain English language for Part 91, the AIP. There is a world of information out there. It's available to us through a lot of our EFB providers. and we should be making use of that part of our pre-flight planning, and to be aware of what the circumstances are at that particular location. So talking about positions, and I'm being very specific here, it's not quite so high level, but specifically in terms of where you are in relation to a circuit or inbound position to an airport, there's no help to any other pilot if you use a local feature. And there's no help for a VFR pilot if there's an IFR waypoint being used that they might not be familiar with. So distance and bearing and quadrants from the airport are definitely going to be the easiest way to communicate exactly where you are, what you're intending to do. And so I guess to summarise, the key thing is communicate clearly, be aware of what other aircraft are doing, think about what that other pilot might need from you in terms of what your intentions are for your operation. And if in doubt, speak up, particularly over the radio. Where are you? What are you doing? Where will we possibly intersect, and how can we separate ourselves? So that's the key points I was hoping to pass on. I'm happy to take questions at the end, and I'll hand back to Greg. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. That's full of information, that one. So some of the interesting facets for me are the fact that airline pilots are out there flying RALs aircraft, glider pilots are flying RALs aircraft. The alerted see and avoid principles, reliant on clear, concise and timely radio calls. And she talked about the risks where RPT, regular public transport, meet recreational aircraft at aerodromes, the regular public transport preferring Australian approach, and the importance of the RALs tailoring their circuits accordingly. So that was an excellent presentation. We'll move now to Air Vice Marshal retired Alan Clements. So Alan Clements has flown everything from Hawker Siddeley 748 aircraft to FA-18 aircraft, our own resident fighter pilot. So Alan himself has also got a different perspective, and I'd like to welcome Alan to the microphone this morning. Thanks, mate.
Well, Greg and Safeskies, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. Yes, my background is a little different, but I would say that in terms of the exposure to the environment, it's probably very similar to many of the people that are on the call today. I've always worked on a little mnemonic that says your attitude determines your altitude, and this leads back to, I think, our first couple of presentations about the professionalism that's required, and what Jill said, that you don't have to be a professional aviator to have a professional attitude about it. And one of the other things that I love to think about is where Kobe Bryant used to talk about professionalism. And then he said, amateurs practice until they get it right, and professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. Now, it's a little bit hard because obviously when we do a lot of flying, it costs a lot of money. So it's very important that all of the flying that we do is getting the value out of every minute that we get airborne. And that therefore goes back to something that was said by Chris and also by Leah, that planning aspect and the knowledge and skills that we have. When we work through, whether it's a military system, a commercial training system, or even our General Aviation Flight School or RAL's flight school, we generally have a system under which we are being trained and a system under which we are being tested. And that hence keeps us safe as we're doing our training. Once we leave those systems and we start to, now we have a license and we intend to operate, and I've got my own aeroplane and I go flying, and I don't have to really talk to anybody apart from to make some CTAF calls when I go out there. But therefore I'm essentially operating independently and I don't have that system around me. I feel it's appropriate that as aviators and as a way of being professional about it is we build our own, what I would call a flight management system around us. It's the thing that professionalism is about, making sure I have the right knowledge and skills to go flying, making sure I'm doing the planning. Do I have a mentor? Do I have another pilot, an experienced pilot that I can talk to? Have I set my own boundaries and limitations that I would fly, whether they be weather limitations, crosswind limitations, even what I'm actually going to fly when I'm airborne? What am I going to practice? How am I using and staying up to date with the technology? So what I've done from the time of leaving the military and leaving a flying management system that is placed around me to keep safe is build my own flying management system. And this is what I would encourage everybody to think about whether you are flying an RAOS or whether you are flying your own GA aircraft or learning, what is that flying management system that you've built around you to be able to keep you safe? I like the idea of choosing when I make my last logbook entry. I don't like the idea of somebody or something else making that choice for me. So my preparation for flying is very detailed around, even if I'm going out for a series of circuits, or I'm going to do a navigation exercise, or if I'm at times now where I'm doing some training and I'm actually, as a flying instructor, teaching something. That preparation that I do is extremely important to make sure that I keep myself, my student, and those around me and using the airspace around me safe from the activity that I'm doing. I really liked the point of Jill was talking about where the accuracy of what you are saying on the radio is really important. There was this statement I used to hear regularly is you have all the situation awareness in the world right up until the point where you don't. And that point, and I have been at occasions where I have lost the situation awareness airborne, and it is really scary. It's quite disconcerting because now you're trying to rebuild what you thought was the picture airborne. But all of that had occurred because of maybe a couple of radio calls or a little bit of information that had been given or I heard that was either wrong or I had interpreted wrong, which makes it very challenging then to make sure you are doing the best in the airspace for others around you. So I would say the accuracy on which you do things, the professionalism which you plan, the knowledge and skills at which you have is really important all the time. And that as aviators, regardless if we are getting paid to do the job or we're not getting paid to do the job, we're paying to do the flying, we need to take the approach that our job is to keep everybody else safe in the airspace around us as we do it. So that were the main points that I wanted to cover today, and we can certainly draw on some ideas around a flight management system or a personal one as we get to the questions. So Greg, I could come back to you now.
Thanks, Alan. Fascinating. Your attitude determines your attitude, and you don't have to be a professional aviator to have a professional attitude towards your flying. Sensational. Thank you very much for that presentation. And just a reminder for those that are tuning in this morning that you can ask questions. You can use the Q&A function in your screens there. And if you could please put, if you have a question for Leah or for Chris or for Jill or for Alan, for Jill, for Jackie, if you can just put that at the head of it and then put your question into the Q&A function, that would be much appreciated. So we're on the era of incredible change in unmanned systems with the advent of advanced air mobility and the predicted rapid expansion of the use of unmanned systems for all sorts and variety of reasons. And an expert in this space is Jackie Jumovic. She's a Safeskies board member and the Chief Executive of Hover UAV. And we'll throw to you, Jackie, please, for your perspectives.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just trying to figure out, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can. You'll just need to pop them in presenter mode.
Okay, hang on a sec. From the beginning. Okay, that should be in presenter mode now.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, as Greg mentioned, so I'm in from the uncrewed sector, and today I'm sort of looking at it from two perspectives. So what I do at Hover is we write a lot of safety cases. So how can the uncrewed sector, work in the skies, but keep that safety, that aviation legacy of a safe skies, so other people in the sky and also the people in the ground. So I'm looking at it from two perspectives today is, what do we need from the uncrewed sector to keep professional, but also what we need from the crewed sector and their professional use of the airspace to ensure that they're safe. We're not actually up in the sky, but they are. And the last thing anyone from the uncrewed sector is to want to have a mid-air collision or an incident involving a crewed aviation person that causes harm to them. So should be able to see the second slide now. So a little bit of a statistic that came out of the RPAS conference last week in Canberra. So Pip Spence mentioned that the remote pilot licence holders, or REPLs as we refer to them, are now the biggest piloting group in Australia. So that also doesn't include the recreational users or the excluded. So the number, I can imagine, is quite large, but I thought that's quite an interesting statistic to start the presentation with. I'm going to just quickly explain, I guess, where we've come from. People think about drones and they're often thinking, you know, these small little toy things, which have been around for a while, you know, the DJI's got a remote controller, people are down on the ground. They're relatively not going to cause too much harm. They're flying below 400 foot and they're visual line of sight. So the pilot's there looking, going, oh, there's a crewed traffic. Okay, we'll lower down, or, you know, there's a person on the ground, so we'll maneuver across. The last few years, we've seen a lot of organisations move to extended visual line of sight. So very similar, you're using a person to be able to mitigate that risk. So that the risk is to other air users is very, very low. So they're just looking and going, yep, we're going to mitigate it, you know, we're going to lower whatever it may be. What we're sort of starting to see is the trend over the last few years, and probably the biggest increase we're going to see in the next few years, is something called BVLOS. Now that is beyond visual line of sight. So that could be a remote pilot sitting in a completely different state or an office or a different location, flying a remotely piloted aircraft, as I said, in a different location. They now no longer can see the other air traffic around, so they don't have a visual observer doing that. So they utilise systems and procedures to mitigate that risk to other air and ground users. So flying, I'm going to mostly focus on flying beyond visual line of sight safely. So to get an REPL, there are basic qualifications. The training schools around Australia are, you know, usually between 3 and 5 days. Fairly simple to sort of pass. They teach you the basic understanding of, you know, the RPA equipment, air rules and things like that. When you start flying BVLOS, you need to get additional training from within the organisation. You also need different licence requirements. And last year, CASA released a new licence requirement for beyond visual line of sight, which took away from the IREX qualification, which we'd need previously. This actually now meant that the entry point to beyond visual line of sight was a lot easier for people. IREX was a hard qualification. Just remembering that most people of those REPL do not come from a traditional crewed aviation background. So now with this new licence, it sort of opened up the beyond visual line of sight market, along with advancements in technology. So flying beyond visual line of sight safely is really important to understand your associated risks. So if we are doing that, or we're doing it for clients, there is a very long process of developing a SOAR risk assessment. This is not just a 2-page, it's usually 100+ pages of looking at those, you know, the risk to other air traffic, and, you know, who's going to be in that sky. We have to identify, you know, where you are, who you are, and the initial stakeholder engagement. We then place mitigations into assist to manage those risks to the other air users or people on the ground. And some of the air mitigations that we commonly use and see for beyond visual line of sight for strategic or tactical mitigations are stakeholder engagement. So from developing to find out who's in that air to continue. So please, from both sides, so we always do try to reach out to the local air traffic to sort of understand where you're flying, what do you use? Are you using radios? You know, are you putting NOTAMs in? Like, where are you expected to be flying? So we can sort of, you know, work with you to make sure that we're lowering that risk or chance of a mid-air collision. We use common rules and mitigations all the time. So this is where we really love when people from the crewed world do follow all of their rules and mitigations. So the lower safe altitudes, or, you know, their approaches, or whatever it may be, we utilise that a lot. ADSB is probably one that, I mean, I would love if all aviation had that. It would make a lot safer sky if we knew where everyone was. So we do utilise that, but we do know that there's only a portion of the airspace users currently using that. So yeah, we can't always 100% rely on it. We place NOTAMs in every time we're flying. Unfortunately, they do get put in head office, so it's really important that we try to stress to, you know, in that stakeholder engagement to crew, please read the head office NOTAMs as well, because that's where the drone NOTAMs get placed. We utilise radio calls. The same as crewed aviation, we have a lot of operational procedures, checklist, emergency procedures, and maintenance as well. So hopefully that's just given you a little bit of an insight from the uncrewed side, and I'll pass back to Greg.
Thanks very much for that, Jackie. Fascinating presentation. And I had no idea that the remotely piloted licenses were now over 33,000, comparing to over 30,000 conventional pilot licenses. And certainly there's been great advances in the approvals of beyond visual line of sight for uncrewed systems. And of course, I think you emphasise the importance of everyone, not just the crewed sector, but the uncrewed sector, knowing and following the rule set as it exists. So fascinating presentation, Jackie. So thank you very much for that. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer section of your computer in front of you there. But I might kick it off with just a couple of questions first, and these are for the panel members. So for the panel members, I'll ask you in general. If you'd like to answer, then please switch your camera and your mic on. But I'm interested in your views of the biggest risk as you see it in your area of aviation today. So who'd like to take that one from the panel this morning? Before I hit you up. Here we go, Alan.
Oh, I won't leave you hanging there, Greg. I'll try and have a go at that. It's probably not going to be as obvious as what everything. I think it goes along the lines of what we were saying today. I think lack of preparation is our biggest risk across the board. And what that leads to then is unsafe activity airborne, whether that be, near misses, running out of fuel, control flight and terrain, installing the aircraft, whatever the actual incident maybe occur. I think it goes back to preparation and being able to, on the ground, before you get into the air, have a very clear idea of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Then if everybody was doing that, then you don't end up with people that maybe not obeying their standard operating procedures or not obeying the rules or making, what you might call as an unforced error while you're airborne, rather than some having to make a decision and maybe not making the right decision because of a change in circumstances. So I guess it's maybe a little bit different, but I actually think it's a lack of preparation. It's one of our biggest risks at the moment.
Thanks, Al. And Jill, you have a perspective as well from your perspective in RAOs?
Yeah, I totally agree with Al's comments. I also believe one of the biggest challenges we all face as aviators, regardless of whether we're flying crewed or uncrewed, is the fact that the airspace is becoming more congested. More people and activities want to make use of that airspace, and particularly we talk about the J-curve of Australia's east coast and our Western Australian cousins as well. Everyone wants to operate in that area. We've got new airports popping up, Western Sydney as an example, and the airspace is becoming so much more congested for flight training activities. That's forcing a lot of the schools to come out to the regional areas where you're seeing higher levels of activities at CTAFs than what you expect. You might have an airport where there's 4 or 5 Sydney-based schools that might come out to Bathurst, Orange, Mudgee, those sorts of areas to take advantage of the less congested airspace. So it's much more critical, again, that we talk about operating in non-controlled environments if we're departing from the controlled environment and using standard procedures from that perspective.
Thanks, Jill. I'll come back to congestion in just a moment. Chris, have you got something from your perspective? No? If you have got something, I can't hear or see you, but we'll go on to Jackie. I've got a question for Jackie, which is Jill talked about congestion. And I'm interested from the uncrewed sector perspective, when will we arrive in the Jetson era? So when I talk about the Jetsons, I talk about advanced air mobility, and that's me being able to go to, in a capital city, go to a helipad and get on an unmanned system and get shuttled to the airport. How far away is that, do you think?
Look, I mean, people used to think, I think, what was it, Uber saying in 24 originally, but look, I mean, the number that's being thrown out at the moment from WISC and other organisations like that is the 32 Olympics up on the Gold Coast. So that's when we may see it. There's a lot of work on, how do we manage the airspace, a lot of, infrastructures, a lot of work to be done prior to that. I think we'll start to see those same sort of systems being used either without people to start with or for cargo and things like that, more in rural and remote areas. So maybe you can't just jump on it, but as I said, 32 Olympics is when they've said.
Okay, certainly that's what I'm hearing within a decade, that certainly airports like Western Sydney Airport, who initially didn't plan for a helipad, are now redesigning the landing area for urban air mobility into their airport. I'm interested also in delving. I know that Jackie raised, please check your head office NOTAMs as well. But as a pilot, I found it somewhat discouraging when I went to check NOTAMs, and there were a myriad of NOTAMs for locations, and then of course the area NOTAMs as well. And it really discouraged a comprehensive understanding sometimes of the environment in which you operate. So I'd be keen to understand the panel's views of whether NOTAMs are a help or a hindrance sometimes in the way in which you operate. So who'd like to take that one? Nobody wants to take that one? Alan, thank you.
No worries, Greg. I certainly found it challenging. I can understand why it is very difficult to find even using Oz runways these days, you can find the NOTAMs, but if you don't do it correctly, then you can certainly miss things like head office NOTAMs, restricted airspace NOTAMs. So there's probably been multiple occasions at an airport that I operate out of where people have turned up and they haven't read the NOTAMs because the restricted airspace that had been activated, they've flown into that restricted airspace unknowing that it was activated. So I agree that it is a challenge. I think it would be great if Air Services and CASA could work together to find a way that it would be much easier technologically for people to not make mistakes like that. But I think it comes back to those things we spoke earlier about, the professionalism, the ability to plan correctly. And part of the responsibility is our training system as well, to ensure that we are really educating and giving the skills to those people we train to be able to do that on a habit basis so that they are able to find and not make the mistakes under the current system.
Thanks, Alan. And I might throw Leah into the deep end with that. So at what stage of training, you're talking to students about NOTAMs and the complexity in perhaps understanding some of those?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. The really interesting thing about the way we set up our flight training is students practically start flying from week 2. So they're really thrown in the deep end. But what that requires is a really clear basis and understanding from the get-go as to what information sources they need to have access to and how to interpret. So one of the challenges that we're seeing as new generations come through, and obviously we see the brunt of generation, I think, Alpha now, is that difference in absorbing information. And I think we've all, seen memes and can attest to the fact that the next generation is learning differently. So we need to be really acutely aware of that and understanding what information is really critical for them to be safe and what is something that they can defer later in their training as they develop their skills. So what do they need right from the get-go versus that long-term picture. Second to that, it's about those what often are called, soft skills, or I prefer to say non-technical skills, because they really are the hard skills to learn, about communication, decision making, and judgment. So all of these places of information. It's about making a judgment call, what's useful for your flight and what's useful for you in that moment. So how do we teach judgment? How do we teach decision making? I think that's the next step in our evolution of training, particularly when technology makes more and more activities automated. So how do we actually embed that, particularly in young people? So being in a university context, we're fairly fortunate that we've got other ways and means of assessing and interrogating critical thinking and judgment skills and decision making. But I don't know whether that's embedded across the sector and whether we should be doing more as an industry to look at that competency as part of training. NOTAMs, like many other information channels, are just tools to give you that big picture, but it's up to the individual to put the puzzles together and understand what's going to be relevant for them. So at RMIT Aviation Academy, we're really passionate about looking at that judgment and critical thinking piece and how we can weave that in early and actually assess that as a competency.
That's terrific. In relation to NOTAMs, I might just go one final item of pre-flight planning and execution is checklists. And as the Chief Commissioner of the ATSB, the very first accident site that I went to was the loss of the Super King Air at Essendon Airport, departing off runway 17, veering left and striking the top of the direct factory outlet shopping centre at Essendon, killing the pilot and 4 American golfers. And one of the findings of the investigation was that there was a failure to recenter the rudder trim in the pre-flight checks, and a number of opportunities existed to recenter the rudder trim, but a failure to follow the checklist was considered to be a significant contributing factor. And we did a big publicity campaign at the ATSB to follow the checklist in sequence and without omission and out loud. So I might just ask as a final question to the panel there, whether if there are any other views on the value of using checklists without omission and in sequence and out loud. Chris.
Hopefully, first of all, the biggest risk for me today is technology. So hopefully this is working, is it?
Yes, just fine, mate. Thank you. Well, the luck of the Irish, as soon as he said it's working, it stopped working again. So my understanding is we do have a question here. So it relates to ADSB. So given that ADSB is not yet mandated, how do we persuade Oz Runways to and Avplan to exchange their traffic information so users of both systems can see the aircraft using the other electronic flight bag, so using iPads, etc. So would anyone like to tackle that one in relation to the use of ADSB, given that it's not yet mandatory, and perhaps anyone would like to suggest whether it should be mandatory? I'll throw this one to Jill first of all. Thank you.
This is a really complex area, Greg, as you'd know, and other members of the panel would know. It's bigger than just Oz Runways and Avplan, because glider pilots use a FLAM system, which uses different frequencies and is not picked up, as I understand it, in Australia through ADSB. And I may be talking at a school there. I don't want to speak on behalf of the Gliding Australia personnel, but it is just such a complex area. There are so many different types of conspicuity, I can never say that word, electronic ID devices, that it's a real challenge. So I don't know that the answer is just simply mandating EFB providers talk to each other, because there's commercial interest there as well. We also have to just consider the entire field of FLAM, ADSB, EFB, and pilot awareness and planning. And I think we're circling back to the pilot being very aware of what type of activities might be occurring. If you're flying through an airspace that's non-controlled and there's a gliding competition, you should see that in the NOTAM, and you should be aware that there might be a large number of gliders, as an example, or even paragliders or hang gliders. So there are a lot of other pieces of software. Someone else has just put up av traffic. There's flight radar. There's any number of these. But the problem is that if we're not using those things, we're not necessarily visible to other pilots. So it's a work in progress, and there's been a lot of good work within industry, as I understand it, to try and improve those visibilities. I might hand over because there are probably people with more experience and understanding than me.
Thanks, Jill. We'll quickly duck to Alan, and then we'll go to Jackie, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks, Alan.
I just wanted to make a comment about the connection across a variety of different systems. You know, we have to be very, it sounds like a great idea on paper, and it is if we could make it work, but there is a whole bunch of technology challenges in update rates and a variety of communication methods, etc., that are problematic to make this occur, not necessarily impossible. And if we don't get it right from the beginning, you actually can build a false picture as well of what's actually going on. I would contend to go to a bit what Jill said. A lot of the preparation that pilots need to do is to understand the environment in which they're going into. Technology is absolutely great, and I'm a full supporter of getting as much technology in our aircraft as we can, but we've got to be also careful. I've seen it in other cases where we become technology cripples and we rely on it. We don't get our head outside the cockpit and look for other aircraft that are around and rely on the fact that it doesn't show up on my Oz runways or it hasn't shown up on my ADSB. So I think the preparation is important, the technology is important, and as we move towards more technology, CASA needs to think about how that is integrated across the board into our aircraft and across the system of systems approach. But hand over to Jackie.
Jackie, thank you. Yeah, just on mute, Jackie. You're still on mute. Thank you.
There always had to be someone that did that. I guess myself and most of the uncrewed sector are a huge sort of supporter of mandatory ADSB. I think it's going to be a real crucial part, and it'll be interesting when the white paper comes out mid this year of what their take on EC and electronic. I hate that word as well, Jill. I think we should actually just sort of start saying let's change it completely, conspicuity. It'll be interesting to see what that comes out with. A lot of those tools like ADSB are required for that future, how the airspace is going to be managed in the future. There's a lot of, we talk about, UTMs and FIMs and a lot of that stuff. It is going to be a crucial component. And I really do hope that we do go down mandatory sort of some form of EC for safety.
All right, folks, listen, I know there's a couple of questions more, but the next webinar is actually going to be about technology. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And on behalf of the panel this morning, I'd like to thank you for attending. So just to summarise in very short, sharp fashion, you've heard from Leah, you heard from Chris, Jill, Alan and Jackie. There's a common theme that pervades all of the presentations this morning, and that could be boiled down to, I think, that safety first is not just a slogan, it's a personal value. The fundamentals of professionalism include competence, communication and commitment. Clear and concise communication is paramount, and you don't have to be a professional aviator to have a professional attitude towards your flying. So that's all we have time for this morning, but I'd like to thank the panel for their outstanding contributions. I know there are a couple of questions in relation to UTM. We'll carry those forward to the next webinar, but I'd like to thank Leah, Chris, Jill, Alan and Jackie, and also Safeskies Australia and RMIT for hosting this morning's event. And a reminder that the second in this series of webinars is scheduled for the 8th of May 2024 from 11 till 12 again. That's an Australian Eastern Standard Time, and we'll examine advances in technology which can assist crewed and uncrewed pilots in navigating the increasingly congested airspace safely. So I'll ask Margot just to take note of the questions that we have in relation to UTM in particular. And finally, thank you again for participating this morning. Blue skies and tailwinds. I'm Greg Hood, and goodbye for now.